It's 2025 and a new year means brand new opportunities. And for a lot of you out there, I know you've been thinking about one thing over the holidays, and that is starting your own business. But you have so many questions like how do I get started? How do I come up with a brand? How do I even sell stuff to people? And what am I even going to sell? Now take a deep breath. Shopify has got you. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. And you can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. You don't have to be a coding nerd or a design geek to get this done. All you need to do is drag and drop. Shopify also helps with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, so you can focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/truecrime, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/truecrime to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/truecrime.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, the final Bro.
Oh, that's so sad, Al. To leave this behind kind of breaks my heart. It's been such a ride, right?
It has been a saga because, you guys, we have been recording like crazy. The Prosecutor's Podcast episode series of the Murdaugh case, including the trial. And obviously this is like, I don't know, our 20th live. Not really, but it feels like it. And in that time, Brett's drank 20 million gallons of bourbon. And I have grown a whole human. And this part is true. Thank you guys for your well wishes. This baby is getting evicted in like days. So baby watch will be over soon, but not before we talk about the verdict.
I know, which was our ongoing joke. We recorded an episode today, as a matter of fact. And the last thing we said was, will we get a verdict or we get a baby first? And how could we know?
It was up in the air. It was up in the air. I really thought the baby was going to beat the verdict. We will talk about all of it today, guys. We will cover closings. We will cover jury misconduct, dismissing jurors, alternates. We will stay here all night because whatever, if the baby comes, and I'll just take the microphone with me to the hospital. And of course, we will talk about the time of deliberation, if that was fast, if that was what was expected, and of course, the guilty verdict. Guilty on all counts, and even ending with the mandatory remand with Alec in handcuffs, walking away, never with even a glance back to Bus, which was really sad for Bus.
And I've got my massive cup of coffee here, so I am ready to go all night long. Let's do this. And I want to start on a somber note, not to depress everybody at the very beginning, but I'm curious what people felt when the verdict came down, because I was very nervous as they were getting ready to read it, because I truly believed he was guilty and truly believed that the prosecution did a great job, and I was going to be so disappointed if the jury had come back not guilty, which when they come back in 3 hours, they have a verdict. There's not going to be, they obviously weren't hung. So it was going one way or the other. And I was not looking forward to the multiple episodes Alice and I were going to have to do defending the jury system after that, because people were already complaining about the jury system before we even had a verdict. And then the verdict came down, and obviously I was happy about it. But then immediately I was sad. And I think it kind of goes to the limitations of the justice system. All we can do is bring the guilty to justice. But I didn't feel a lot of joy there. You know, 2 people are dead. They're never going to be brought back. It is impossible to imagine the thoughts that went through their heads in those last few moments when their father, you know, there is no doubt in my mind that they loved him. And there's no doubt in my mind that he loved them at some level. For him to do that, and I don't know, it was just sort of this overwhelming sadness kind of hit me. And it was as much as it was a celebration of justice, it was sadness that, this is humanity and this is life.
Yeah. And thank you for starting it out on that note, because obviously people have been very invested in this for 6 weeks of trial and years of investigation. And it's easy to kind of have this elation if you were for, team guilty, or incredible sadness. But I think that's true, Brett. There are no winners, unfortunately, in the criminal justice system, because we're only in the criminal justice system because something devastating has happened. We've talked a lot about the family dynasty and how powerful they are, and how that may have a lot to do with the motive of bringing, the legacy that is the family. I take no joy that the Murdaughs have fallen from the highest of places to really the lowest of places. I am so sad for Buster. I am so sad for each of his brothers. I don't care whether they knew or not. I don't care whether they lied or not. An entire, generations of family are ruined. An entire community will never quite recover from this. The Low Country, South Carolina, if you are from this area, this will define how people view you for a very long time. And so, just remember that these are real lives. These attorneys have given sweat, tears, and blood. This is not just a job. When you do this type of work, defense or prosecution, it is not for a paycheck. You do it with your entire life behind it. There is not a single case that Brett and I have tried that has not taken a piece of who we are and defined who we are, because you care about your work. It is truly doing something of a greater purpose. So whatever you feel about Waters, about Griffin, about Poop Poop, all of those things, remember they are real people, and it has defined their lives as well. And we say all that just to set the stage, and we're going to talk about all of your legal questions, all of your factual questions, but keep that in mind. This is not entertainment for the people who were involved. This is life and the justice system.
And I've never been to a sentencing that I didn't feel bad, that I didn't feel some amount of sorrow for the people who were going to prison and for their family that were left behind. And Alice mentioned mandatory remand. And what that means is, in a lot of cases, when you're convicted, you are automatically remanded to prison. It doesn't always happen. In fact, if you've been out, which he wasn't, but if you've been out on bond throughout the trial, oftentimes you'll stay on bond after the trial. A good example of this is the Theranos case. Elizabeth, whatever her last name is, she's currently out on bond, awaiting final remand to prison. Not a violent crime. She was on bond the whole time. Usually that happens. Automatic remand, though, as soon as you're found guilty, you go to jail. And I had a case once where a lady, it was a nurse actually, and she was stealing medication and selling it to fund her own habit that she had. And she pled guilty. And her lawyer, I guess, had done a poor job of telling her that mandatory remand was what was going to happen. And she pleads guilty. And we go to sentencing. And she wanted to stay out between when she was sentenced and when her daughter had her baby. And she didn't know, no, this is automatic. Once the judge accepts your guilty plea and sentences you, you're going to prison. And she just died. She started crying. She was so upset. It was one of those cases, it was kind of tragic on the one hand anyway, because she obviously had an addiction. And the judge looked at me and said, "Do you oppose her staying out?" And I had to say, because of the law, yeah, the law requires her to be remanded automatically. And that felt really bad. And this is a little different because obviously Alec Murdaugh is a monster in many ways, but I don't know anything about Buster. I don't know anything about his brothers. For all I know, they're all fine, upstanding people. But what I do know is this is absolutely devastating for them and their family. And I think it's worth remembering, even as we are all happy that justice is done in this case.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to take us back to closing, and then we can talk about the verdict. So as you guys know, the judge actually asked the attorneys how long they wanted for closing, and they both agreed to 3 hours. 3 hours, relatively, is a pretty long time for a closing. Short trial closing was typically 30 minutes to an hour, and you kind of want to stay in the hour zone, because have you ever tried to sit still for 3 hours? It's really hard. You lose people's attention. Because of the length of the trial, 6 weeks, the amount of evidence, 3 hours is probably proper, and each side gets the same amount. Prosecution always goes first because the burden is on the prosecution. And we've talked about this when you guys mentioned how slow it seemed that the evidence took to come in. doesn't really matter because it just has to come in so that it can be talked about in the closing. And the closing is argument. Remember, opening, you setting the stage and you're saying what evidence will come in, but it's not supposed to be argument. Closing, all that goes out the window. It is the time for the prosecution to tell you what they think happened based on the evidence that's been admitted. And Creighton Waters gave the whole 3-hour closing. He gets a rebuttal too, but he did the entire closing. And I will say, those of you who haven't seen a lot of real life closings and have only seen Hollywood closings, it was excellent. It really, truly was excellent because you have to balance certain things. You have to balance outrage, passion, storytelling, and teaching, right? He brought the right amount of fire, I thought. He is bringing the indignity of this tragic crime on behalf of the people, on behalf of Paul, on behalf of Maggie, on behalf of their families and all of their loved ones. But you are also holding the fate of a man's life in your hands, and you have to be the appropriate amount of fire, right? This is not the time to come in with a bludgeon because that's not appropriate for the state to do. I thought he did strike the right balance, but he also spoke with such conviction that he knew justice was on his side. And he also, I thought, tied the evidence together in a very compelling way. I mean, clearly this was something he lived and thought about for a long time. I mean, there were turns of phrases that I thought were just poetic that will probably be quoted, for a very long time. The way he humanized the last moments of Maggie and Paul, I think were incredibly effective because no one can testify to what they actually felt. They can testify to the way their heads were turned, the way their brains were blown out of their heads, the way they were running, what may have happened in those last moments, but no one can actually testify to what they felt. And in closing, he could do that. And I thought he gave a really compelling visual of what was happening. And I think one of the things that you'll probably hear over and over is that whether it was true or not, it could fit the evidence. He said the last thing Maggie was thinking was she was running to her baby. I mean, just putting the word baby in there made me cheer up, and I wasn't even ready for that because it humanized the fact, what a lot of you have said. Paul may have been disliked. He may have been driving a boat, probably was really driving a boat that killed Mallory Beach. And he had a lot of faults in life, but he was someone's child. He was someone's baby. No one deserves that type of an end. And I thought that was a beautiful way to weave that in, to truly show you the victims that are in this case.
And I just want to say, look, people get things wrong all the time. We get things wrong all the time. We analyze stuff and we come to the wrong conclusion. The very first episode of Legal Briefs, we talking about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, and we thought the jury would basically split the baby and nobody get anything. We got that wrong. That happens. But I got to tell you, some of the analysts in this case, I hope you all remember who they were and what they said for the next trial so that they do not lead you astray the way they led many people astray in this case and convince people that the prosecution was doing a terrible job and there was no evidence and he's probably going to be acquitted. And if he's not acquitted, it's going to be a hung jury. And then 3 hours later, the jury comes back with a conviction. And one of the reasons for that was the excellent closing argument that everybody in the media also said was terrible. And people kept asking us, like, we hear this is really terrible. Is this really terrible or not? And I thought, and I had not seen it because I was skiing when it happened. And so as I'm driving home, my wife and I are listening to this argument so that, we could talk about it on Monday when the jury comes back, not realizing it was going to happen today. And I'm thinking as I start this 2.5 hour thing, because it was about 2.5 hours long, man, everybody's saying how terrible this is going to be. This is going to be really boring on this drive. It was awesome. It was an awesome closing that did everything it was supposed to do. And this just irritates me, so forgive me when I get on my soapbox. It's one thing for people who are not lawyers, who aren't prosecutors, who aren't defense attorneys, to be surprised by that kind of closing, because we're used to the Hollywood closing that lasts 5 minutes and it's very fiery and beautiful and, all this other stuff. That's not a real closing. And the people who should have known that's not a real closing, that this is a real closing, and that this was actually an excellent closing, went on television and acted like it was terrible, because that's the way you get people to watch you. People don't watch you when you say, yeah, you did a great job. they watch you and you're like, oh, that was terrible. I'm really worried about the case. The whole thing's falling apart. What are they doing, right? The critic is always the one who gets all the clicks. And it just drives me crazy. And it's driven me crazy this entire case. And so, like I said, I hope people paid attention. And when we're talking about the trial in the Idaho case, or we're talking about the trial in the Delphi case, or we're talking about the Lori Vallow case, or whatever the next trial is, remember the people that you can't trust. And don't let them get you wrapped around the axle again, because it's just not worth your time, and they're not helping you understand anything.
That's a great point. I had so many friends text me during all of the recesses when the talking heads would come on and basically just attack the prosecution and say all these things like the jurors, they're crying and they're completely on Murdaugh's side. And I was like, maybe, I don't know. I'm not in the courtroom, so I can't speak to how the jurors are acting. And it's a fool's errand, by the way, trying to decipher what the jurors are thinking. But they're always going to do that. They're going to attack the prosecution. Even while I was like, are we watching the same trial? Because I think the prosecution's doing a fantastic job. And we'll talk about the speed of the deliberations. You guys are right. Under 4 hours, about 3 hours of deliberation is really fast for 6 weeks. Typically, a rule of thumb doesn't always work. A speedy verdict is typically good for the prosecution because it's a lot harder to acquit with 12 people. And it's also with a hung jury, you typically have 1 or 2 people and there's usually a lot of fighting. And so it gets dragged on. So typically, rule of thumb, if you have a quick verdict, it typically tips in favor of the prosecution. But I'm tipping my hand for the verdict. All that to say is, with the amount of text the two of us were getting from people who are like, am I watching the same trial as everybody else? Because you guys are the only ones saying that the prosecution is doing a good job. And everyone is beating up on, the prosecution that they don't know what they're doing. They knew what they were doing. And this is just the truth. Trials are tedious. And there are rules that are in place to protect your and my due process rights under the Constitution. And thank goodness they exist. I would rather have a 6-week-long trial and 6 hours of closing arguments if my life were in the balance, rather than a TikTok video of 30 seconds of some funny dance move to show why I'm guilty. So just know that, our justice system has developed over centuries, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of justice systems before it. But know that the justice system is tedious. The prosecution walked through all of the steps it needed to. It did not take any short steps. It didn't, the closing for the defense, we'll get to this, really harped on how messy the investigation was. I don't think this was a messy investigation. Could certain things have been done? Sure. There is an unexhaustive list of things that can be done in your life at all times, same as in an investigation. Just because they're not done does not make it a shoddy investigation in and of itself. So I'm really glad that this trial got all the attention that it did, that it was streamed pretty much in its entirety. I think more people watched this trial in its entirety than just like TikTok clips than other cases, for whatever reason. First of all, it was fascinating. But I think by watching the trial and not just watching TikTok clips of it, you begin to understand the depth of the justice system and understand for yourself what is a good case and what is not a good case. So I just want to pat you guys on the back because most of you, in the gallery at least, were agreeing that the prosecution seemed to be walking through the correct steps.
Yeah, and Marianne said it's not the critic that counts. And I was literally thinking that today, that more of my brethren, because defense attorneys, they always think the person's innocent, and that's fine. They bring a different perspective. We love that perspective. It's one reason we love Bob Murdaugh, who we have a lot of respect for, and is about the only person on television who made any sense. So if you want to follow these things in the future, just listen to Bob Murdaugh. But the prosecutors who are nitpicking every single thing the prosecution did, I kept thinking about that. Like, it is so easy to do. And you can say I would do it differently. There were things the prosecution did that I was like, oh, I don't know about that. The order some of the witnesses came in, some of the time they spent on the financial stuff, I was like, I don't know that I would do that. But the fact that I might do it differently doesn't mean that that's right. And they were the ones who have lived with this case for a year, and they knew how they wanted to present their case, and they presented it exactly the way they wanted to. And they were prepared, and they were ready. And I will tell you, to me, the fact they were prepared, they were organized, they knew how they were going to do it, and they got it done was impressive. And honestly, if you compare that to the closing of the defense, you see where I don't know what was going on with Jim Griffin. He is obviously a good attorney. He's shown that throughout this trial. His closing argument was abysmal. Yeah, I mean,
something
it
happened.
was bad.
It seemed like, in an athlete, an athlete's capabilities, and they have like a mental block, and something happens on the field where you're like, that's not the same athlete that I know is capable of doing other things. Jim Griffin is a good attorney. Something was going on, and that's why I tried to humanize the attorneys in this case at the beginning. We don't know what's going on with them. We don't know who they spoke to. We don't know if they spoke to Buster, if they spoke to their client. They came to certain revelations about themselves. It's really hard not to get personally invested in your cases. This client is not just a client. I mean, truly, they've sat next to him, breathed the same air, eaten with him for months on end. And we don't know what was going on in Jim's head. But the truth is, if you watch the closing, he was disorganized. He lacked any sort of passion one way or the other. I thought I was watching like a breach of contract or an insurance case closing as opposed to a murder defense closing. You have to also read the jury on what the appropriate amount of emotion is. But there can be just as impassioned of a closing in defense of someone who's been being tried for murder as there is for the prosecution. In fact, those are some of the best closings. The whole who he is and what he's built over his life and how this is not who he is. And there was a lot of umming and ahhing, and like he seemed unsure of himself. He lacked confidence in what he was saying. And again, I don't know what happened. Something happened, I think, in his own life or his mental block or something. But the closing I thought was incredibly disorganized, ineffective, poorly delivered.
And, I don't know if Poot was like, I'm going to do the closing until the last minute and then said, actually, you should do it, Jim. And he just had to do it on the fly. Or, this is all speculation. The one time Jim was passionate was when he talked about Paul and talked about his friend Paul. And I almost feel like Jim might have been too close to this case. And that maybe at some point he really did kind of realize, you know what? He killed him. He killed him. He killed my friend Paul, which is what he called him in the closing. And even though he was trying to do his job and trying to do a good job, it really was in his head, even if it was subconscious, because there's just no reason for a closing to look like that. You notice the prosecution, they had a theme. And basically, he structured his delivery around means, motive, and opportunity, right? Or motive, means, and opportunity. I forget the order he put it in, but he had a structure, and he used that structure to move through the evidence and show how each piece of evidence helped establish those various things, right? Jim had no structure. He had points he made, but there was no organization to it whatsoever. He was just all over the place. One moment he's talking about SLED and how they did all the stuff they shouldn't have done. The next moment he's talking about how he didn't really give an interview to HBO, which was just a weird moment where he's like, and I take offense of that.
It was weird to insert himself when the case was clearly about Murdaugh. That's why something was going on. Like, he's a good enough attorney to know that was completely off base.
Yeah. And like Melissa said, even his phone went off in the middle of it. It was just a train wreck. And I'm not just saying that because he was a defense attorney and I disagreed with him. I thought Jim should do it. People asked, why did they ask for 2? Or why did they ask to split it? And I said, the reason is because Harpootlian wants to talk and Jim needs to talk. Jim needs to be the one to do this because he is the more talented attorney, and that's just obvious. I don't know what happened. I'm not sure why it went that way. To answer this question, it is not enough for ineffective counsel. You're never going to get ineffective counsel based on the closing. It just was a poor closing. I don't know what happened, but it just wasn't good. Just objectively, it wasn't good. And they had good points to make. I think Alec Murdaugh is absolutely guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but they had some things they could say. And they had already built in this whole SLED investigation was problematic, which it was only problematic to the extent that if SLED had done a better job, they would have found more evidence of Alec Murdaugh. Going into the house, they kept talking about the house. They should have done more with the house. The murderers were never in the house. If they had done a better job processing the house, what they would have found is more evidence that Murdaugh did it. So that I always thought was a weak argument, but it was one they were going to make. And it's a standard argument. But even that was so disjointed and all over the place. And I don't know what was going on with him, but something was.
But let's say this. I think Brett and I have both had experiences in court and in our legal careers where we've frozen. So we are human beings. And I have thankfully not frozen in a situation like a closing or something of huge consequence like that, but I have absolutely frozen when I should have been on my game, and it happens. Just like athletes, just like any of you in your lives, it can happen where the words are not coming to you. Maybe he got into a fight with Alec or with Poot backstage, before all this happened, or the enormity of what was happening, and he knew the verdict was going to be guilty, hit him really hard right as he was doing it. Who knows? But he's a human, and I think he probably had something better planned. And for whatever reason, it flew out the window. And unfortunately, it wasn't like a 10-minute closing. It was like 2 hours. And it was a rough go to walk through all of it. And here's the thing. You also want to be a storyteller in the closing, especially for defense. When you don't have a defense, you tell a story, and that's okay. That is what you do. You tell a story of Paul as a baby and the loving family pictures or what have you of Alec and Paul and how close he and Buster were and how Moselle was like this boy's dream and, to be cut down in the prime of life in the place that he called home. I mean, whatever. You talk about it as a story. You distract, you humanize, whatever you do. And he didn't do that. And I know he's capable of doing that. But he failed to do that. And I think, the evidence was already so overwhelming. I don't think this only came down to the closing, but I did think that the defense missed points they should have, and the prosecution brought it together. One thing we were really hard on the prosecution about was all of the financial misdeeds, the check after check, and how boring it was. But again, they knew what they were going to do with that. And so they had a plan for it. And I did think it was very effective, that whole line of argument that Waters had of how easily Murdaugh could lie, that it just flowed out of him. It was part of who he was. And he brought it together beautifully. If he hadn't done that, I probably would be a little bit more peeved that he had spent so much time on the financial records things. But he himself knew where the structure was, and he followed that structure, and it worked for him. It might be that when you have too many cooks in the kitchen, like the defense had a lot of different, even their experts fought with each other in a way, through their testimonies. It's possible that when you don't have a clear one head, or maybe you have personalities that are fighting among the defense counsel, that you lose track of who is in charge and kind of what story you're building. And that's what I felt. It felt like a directionless closing for the defense.
And, my wife, who has much more level head than I and doesn't do as much true crime as I do, but loves me and was forced to listen to this entire closing as we were driving down the road, was commenting on how great a story the prosecution told and how they wove a story that by the time you finished it, you just thought, this guy is so guilty. And just as I listened to the prosecution, I was like, this jury has to see it. They have to see it. It is so obvious as he's doing all this. And the thing about the defense, and I think Alice might have put her finger on it because Alice is always right. It is very likely that Harpootlian and Jim Griffin had a different vision for what their defense was going to be. And Harpootlian really wanted to rely on Sled messed everything up, the ballistics aren't right, here's an expert to show that he was shot from the top down instead of from the bottom up. And Jim wanted to focus more on the emotions that you're talking about. And to me, the only way to win this case, and the only thing that gave anyone pause in this case, was the notion that that man would shoot his son. Most people could buy that, husbands shoot their wives all the time, right? So that was never going to work. Like, they had a loving marriage. Okay. Unfortunately happens all the time, right? It's a cliche that the husband did it. But the son and the whole shooting him in the head in this vicious way, this brutal way, this cold-blooded way, people who had reason, they didn't have reasonable doubt because it wasn't reasonable, but it was doubt, and it was emotional doubt. It's almost more powerful than logical doubt, was that. And that should have been the entire focus of the closing. Like Alice said, the entire focus should have been, you can't tell me that you know beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed his family based on circumstantial evidence and pings and a video that could have happened 30 minutes before the murder for all we know. You can't tell me you know he did this when you see how loving they were and here they are coaching baseball and all this other stuff. I agree with Alice 100%. That should have been the focus. And instead, there was no focus. The closing wasn't a focused attack on Sled, and it wasn't a focused building up of this relationship. His best moments were talking about the relationship, and I think that's the moments he believed in. but the rest of it was a mess. And I think that jury went back, and as we said, best story wins. And it was easy for them. They didn't need 3 hours. There were 3 hours between when they went back there and when they came out. The actual deliberations were probably 45 minutes. Remember, everybody else has to get back to the courtroom. Everybody has to get in place. Like, there was a period of time where the jury had come back, let the judge know, and he's letting everybody else know. So this was a really short deliberation.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brett. And we won't harp on Griffin for much longer, but it did sound like he was handed notes and he had to basically give someone else's presentation, and he didn't want to do that. But maybe the client has say in things, and maybe Alec was like, I want what Poot wants, and may have cursed him out and said, this is what you're doing. And so he gave the best argument, except it's not, because he didn't believe in it. And a lot of you pointed that out, right? The best story wins. He could have given an alternate story of what happened where it made his client not guilty. But instead of focusing on one story, he did a lot of what ifs that were completely not backed up by evidence whatsoever. He literally was like, I don't know, maybe Paul found a drug dealer. And you're like, what? Where did that come from? And I say that not to make fun, but you do want, as the defense, to give an alternate theory, an alternate story to create reasonable doubt. But when you're pulling it literally out of thin air and you haven't explored it through the trial, through your cross-examinations, through your witnesses, you're not technically supposed to do that when it's completely not supported by evidence. The defense gets away with this a lot more than they should. But it fell flat, right? Because the jurors are like, what are you talking about? I've given up my life for 6 weeks. I sat here, check after check after check, after expert, looking at people with these, gory autopsy photos. And you're trying to come up with a random list of what could have happened. Remember that inexhaustible list of things you can do in an investigation? There's an inexhaustible list of what ifs, aliens, Yetis, what have you. But that didn't ring true to the jury. So if he really believed in that method, he would have spent a lot more time thinking, okay, what is the best alternate theory that fits the evidence we have? And it's almost like right before he was to take the stand or take the stage, he was like, give me some bullet points of alternate theories because we have to give him another story. It was like he hadn't even thought about what the alternate theory was. You don't have to give alternate theories. I think it's a good tactic to do so, but not in the way that he did it.
And, it's such a good point. The prosecution doesn't often get to mock the defense. Usually it's the other way around. Usually the defense is mocking, something the prosecution's trying to spin. And one thing the defense did get to mock, the whole I did them bad or whatever, prosecution, that was a mistake by the prosecution. That was a misstep. Trying to say that in that video he basically confessed. He did not, and they should have known that, and the defense attacked that in closing, and that was a mistake. But the prosecution got to really go after the defense on the 5'2" killer, which was absurd, and everybody knew it was. Everybody knew it was absurd from the very beginning, and railed on them for that. And then Jim, as Alice was saying, walks into it again with this bizarre, where he basically is like, well, Paul was the little detective. Maybe he found the drug dealers. And then maybe he confronted the drug dealers. And he said, you stay away from my dad or I'm going to tell. And you could see the prosecution was like, what in the world over there? And they finally decided to object, which normally you don't do.
That is totally objectionable.
But that was so objectionable. But it was also silly. Like Alice was saying, it undermined everything else he was saying. It was as if he said maybe aliens came down, found the guns, didn't realize what they were, and accidentally shot Paul and Maggie. I mean, it was that absurd. So, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, don't want to spend this whole time attacking the defense closing because they weren't dealt a great hand, but it could have been better. Unfortunately, I was literally finishing up the defense closing when the verdict came down, so I have not yet seen the prosecution's second closing, so I will have to defer to Alice if she's seen it. I have heard it was brilliant, but I have not seen it.
It was fantastic. So in a rebuttal, you're supposed to make the points that were brought up in the closing. You're not supposed to do like a total rehash because the first close, we call them first close and second close. First close is the longer one, right? The first close is you're telling the story. You have to walk through all the legal stuff too. People forget that it's not just storytelling. It's actually very tedious. You have to go through all of the elements, explain the legal side of what the jury must reach in order to convict, and go through all of the evidence that has been presented in 6 weeks and how it fits into all of those buckets within the elements. So it's actually a really tedious job to do first close. The second close is really where the fire is. And second close is really fun when you're the prosecution because it is the end of the trial. You have had the first close, which is the tedious legalese and bringing all of the evidence together. Then the defense goes, and especially if it's good or bad, you have had to listen and you have an outline for what you want your rebuttal to be. But the rebuttal is where it's an art. You are off the cuff and you are responding in real time to what the defense has just said, especially when you have like a 3-hour-long closing. That's not an easy thing to do because there's a lot of points you want to make and you don't want to do what the defense has done. You don't want it to be scattershot. That's a bad rebuttal. A bad rebuttal is, let me respond to point 1. This is why they're wrong. This is point 2. This is why they're wrong. You'll see inexperienced attorneys do that because it's easier to do that because you can make bullet points as they're talking and just kind of cross off what the defense got wrong. But that's not effective because this is the last thing the jurors hear before they go deliberate. This is when you go for the jugular and you bring 6 weeks worth of trial together to wrap it up in a beautiful package with a bow that says beyond a reasonable doubt. Like there is no reasonable doubt here. Everything they said, that this is why it's an art, is instead of doing the scattershot, you're having to weave it into this beautiful tapestry that is the rebuttal. And they did that. Part of it is they've lived this case. They knew generally what the defense's themes were going to be, and they can anticipate some of that. But I thought the way that he seized on really the lost opportunities in the defense's closing were beautiful. And they didn't operate on the rebuttal. They didn't operate on the defense's terms. They brought it right back to what the prosecution's theory was, which I thought was beautiful. And the story that they told. And there was continuity from first close to second close in a way that it kind of squeezed out the defense's close. It was like the defense didn't even talk. By the end of the rebuttal, I couldn't remember what they said because they drew so much back in of the first close that it weaved this beautiful story that I can only imagine as the jury went out to deliberate. The prosecution had done such a good job of telling them this tight-knit story that fit the facts that they got to see, smell, and taste themselves. Remember, they took a trip to Moselle, right? That they could tangibly feel everything the prosecution was saying before they went back. And that was, like, it was artful.
I didn't get to see it, but I'm going to watch it because I've heard people say that. You know, the last trial, Alice did the rebuttal closing, and you can tell how passionate she is about it. And we won that case, and it was all because of Alice.
It was not. Also, no one got murdered.
I mean, the thing is, really, all the facts and the evidence should be out by that first closing. As Alice said, the first closing, you know, you're giving them the law, you're making some points about circumstantial evidence of what it is. You know, people were so excited that he used the rain analogy, which we've used before. We did not make that up. That is a classic. That is a classic how to explain circumstantial evidence. But yeah, I mean, it can be a little bit more tedious. That last closing is when you can bring the hammer. And the last thing the jury hears, well, the last thing they hear is the jury charge. But the last thing they hear from you, it has to be where you really do bring it all together. And you charge the jury with, you have heard the evidence, whatever your misgivings about finding someone guilty, because that's an important thing. You know, Harpootlian in his opening said to the jury, I want you to do a hard thing. I want you to set aside the fact this man has been arrested and consider him innocent. And he's right. That is a hard thing for anyone to do. We all think somebody gets arrested, they got him, it's over, right? And that is a hard thing to do. Equally hard, though, is to make that final decision. Yes, this man killed his wife and child, and he needs to go to prison for the rest of his life because of it. That's hard, too. And you, in that rebuttal closing, you have to get that jury to where they're willing to accept the evidence. You've already given them all the evidence. Now you have to get them to accept it and not ignore it and not be nullified, you know? And I haven't seen it, but from what everyone has said about it, it sounds like that's exactly what he did. And so I'm looking forward to watching it later on.
And the judge makes a beautiful speech at the end of the verdict where he thanks the jurors. And this is exactly right. You know, I had the opportunity to clerk for a judge who, at the district court level, who really had these beautiful speeches that were heartfelt when he charged the jury before deliberation and also after they reached a verdict. that really hit the heart of their constitutional duty, and to recognize the beauty, though imperfect, system that we've built in this country and how important each of them are. Those 6 weeks were 6 weeks of their lives. Everyone has families and obligations and jobs. I think one of the jurors, almost lost his job because he had to be on the jury for so long. You're not getting paid very much. You get a stipend. It barely covers, your gas, at the very least. You don't get to talk to anyone. And also, there's incredible vicarious trauma in a case like this, where you are charged with justice for a person who's sitting across from you, within feet of you, every single day, and also people who are dead, who can't speak for themselves. And it is a very, very heavy burden, and it's very important. And I think it's beautiful. Like, as much as I, rag on the jury sometimes, I think the jury system is absolutely beautiful. It's unique, the way we use it in our justice system. And I can't think of a better way to go about it in our justice system as well.
Yeah, I agree with Alice on that. We talked about this before, and I see people, even before the verdict came out, people were saying, should we have a different system where, highly educated people are on the jury, or where the judges decide? And I just want to remind people, and I want to preach about this, but when you say that, you're saying, I don't trust myself with upholding our system, and I'd rather turn it over to nameless elites or people with fancy degrees or whatever. And to me, no, I want ordinary people making that decision. That is, to me, one of the most important parts of our system, and I'm glad we have it. The other thing that's important is having good judges. And a lot of you have commented on this, but the judge in this case, I think you saw a judge who was incredibly patient. He allowed both sides to make their arguments. He allowed the defense on occasion, I thought, to kind of overstep on a few things, but he let them do it. And he was very thoughtful. He explained his decisions in detail. He cited to a lot of case law when he did it. And when you're a defense attorney, you hate that. Because what you want is a hot-headed judge who goes off, who doesn't cite to anything, who really barely even lets you make objections, and certainly doesn't explain why he's ruling the way he is, because then on your appeal, you get to point to all these things and how you shouldn't listen to what the judge said, because clearly he didn't put any thought into this. We call it papering the record sometimes. Really good judges paper the record. They explain their reasoning in detail, and it makes it very hard. And you see that on both sides. As prosecutors, we will occasionally have judges go against us. And the worst thing when a judge goes against you is then he writes like a 20-page opinion about why. Because you're like, oh, well, there's no way we're going to win now, right? So he did a great job both in controlling the trial, allowing it to go as long as it needed to go, and it was a long trial, but also respecting both sides, but giving reasons for his rulings. And occasionally, he wasn't going to allow that roadside stuff to come in. And the defense kind of stepped in it on that. And I think there will be an appeal in this case, obviously. It won't be a frivolous appeal because there are real issues, real interesting issues. I think Bob called them like real lawyer issues in one of our things we did with him, like the 404B stuff. That's really interesting stuff. And there is an argument to be made that the judge was wrong. I don't think they're going to be able to reach that burden. It's a heavy burden to overturn a trial, but it's a real issue. I think at the end of the day, this conviction will be upheld, and, it'll be interesting to see what Alec Murdaugh does with all his other charges, because presumably, I think he already has some state charges. Presumably federal charges will follow as well. Once he testified, I think he basically had decided, I'm pleading guilty to those cases, because he was giving it all up in an effort to win this case. So, this is going to be one of those things where by the time an appeal is decided, he probably will have already pled guilty to all that stuff. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Okay. Is there some weird delay for everybody else?
Is this not working? Can you not hear me?
Oh, wow.
What's happening? Why are you laughing? I can't figure it out. laughing. I'm literally, nobody knows why you're laughing.
Okay, that was the weirdest thing. I'm not sure what happened, but it was like, I heard everything you were saying 5 seconds after you said it. And so I left the studio and I came back and now it's fine. So we can continue.